like to extend a warm welcome and thank you for joining our presentation this evening. My name is Cindy Schufelt, and I'm a school support counselor with Thames Valley School Board with the Safe Schools and Wellbeing portfolio. And my colleague Caitlin is joining us this evening, and so I will let her introduce herself.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. As Cindy mentioned, my name is Caitlin Chow. I have the good fortune of working with the Safe Schools and Wellbeing team through Thames Valley District School Board as well. I am an educator who in this role gets to support projects like this one, as well as supporting multiple schools and educators across our valley.
So as Caitlin mentioned, we are very fortunate to be part of this collaboration with community partners as well as our local school boards. And we do have presentations that we have online throughout the year with varying topics. If you were to click on the link in this slide, it will take you to our website where you can see a list of some upcoming presentations that we'll be doing in May. And you'll also see other presentations that we have done in the past. It will also give you some more information about key contacts, and we'll be talking more about that at the end of today's presentation. So this evening, I'm very thrilled to welcome Dr. Caitlin Mendez. She's an associate professor of sociology of Western University and principal investigator of DIY digital safety projects. As well, she'll be speaking tonight to parenting in a digital age. So I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. And just give me a moment to share my screen. Okay, so thanks so much to those of you who've given up your time to come listen tonight. So like Cindy said, I work at Western University, but I'm not just here as a researcher. I'm also here as the parent of 3 boys who are in the Thames Valley District School Board, and my husband is also an elementary school teacher here in London. So I understand and share many of the concerns that many of you have around digital technologies. And so I just want to reiterate that this isn't just an abstract topic for me, but this is one that I am actively navigating in real time along with many of you. You only have me today, but I think it's important to acknowledge that I'm part of a really amazing team. So we have legal scholars like Susie Dunn, a criminologist, Alexa Dodge, and an educational specialist, Chris Dietzel. So our team is almost finished going around Canada talking to young people about their experiences with digital technologies and online harms. And I want to point out the whole aim of our research isn't to say that kids shouldn't be online, or it's not to say that kids shouldn't have their own devices, although I do think having boundaries is incredibly important. But really the aim of the research is to take the knowledge and use it to support young people in their digital lives. So this means things like teaching them how to have healthy relationships with other people and their technology. How can they behave ethically? How can they know what their rights and their responsibilities are? And what are the resources that they can go to if or when things go wrong? So before we begin, I just want to go over the agenda for today's session. So I'm going to start with a little bit about what do we know about young people's experiences online, and I'm going to draw from research that I'm doing now and research that I've been doing over the past few years in the UK with children as well. I'm going to talk specifically about what laws might help, how the tech itself can help, and finish off by thinking about how can we have these supportive and non-judgmental conversations with teens. And of course, we're going to wrap it all up with a Q&A. So really, before we get started, I want to point out that these online harms are real and they're ever evolving. And many of these harms are happening to our children in Canada, in Ontario, and even in London. So over the past few years, we've seen many headlines talking about the risks and harms linked to digital technologies. And we're talking anything from the rise of sextortion to the generation of deep fake nude images. And in fact, just last month, 4 Ontario school boards brought a lawsuit against the makers of Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok for $4.5 billion, saying that these social media apps have disrupted their children's education and they're fundamentally rewiring their children's brains. And they aren't the only ones. So last year, the US Surgeon General issued a warning about how social media may harm children and adolescents. And for those of you who kind of follow or know much about the Surgeon General, this is really rare. You know, if you think over the past 30 or 40 years, the Surgeon General has only ever issued a handful of warnings. And it's been things like make sure you wear your seatbelt, or smoking is bad for you. So the fact that they've issued this warning over social media is actually really significant. And the Surgeon General reminds us that children aren't just smaller adults, but they're fundamentally in a different phase of brain development. And that's something that I think is really important to keep in mind. So, taking kind of a step back, the truth about social media is that, you know, when we look at all of the data, and there's lots of studies across so many different disciplines, the research shows that social media can have both positive and negative impacts on young people's well-being. And I really, you know, I'm going to talk today about online harms and risks, but in doing so, I don't want us to forget about the benefits of tech. And again, the point of my talk is not to kind of fearmonger and say, get your children offline. I think young people have digital rights, and I want them to have the most positive experiences with their technology that they can. And I've spent a lot of time talking to hundreds of young people in Canada and the UK, and young people speak really positively about the impact of digital technologies in their lives, from things like building communities, staying in contact with friends and family, connecting with peers over schoolwork, organizing their schedule, finding information, and learning about social issues. And these are all really great, and I don't want to forget about these things. But the research also shows that social media and digital technologies are enabling a range of old and new harms that we really need to take seriously. So when we talk about harm, one of the things that my team pushes for is having really precise language. So one of the things I'm going to do today is introduce a term called tech-facilitated sexual violence, and I'm going to explain what that is. But the reason that we're doing this is because so often all of these online harms are lumped together as things like cyberbullying. And my team has made lots of arguments that we think this does a real disservice to many of the young people and the harms that they experience. Because if we write off, you know, constantly getting pressured to send nude images of yourself as a form of cyberbullying, that actually really limits the kind of responses that they think are available to them. And it can also really minimize the harm. You know, it's just a bit of bullying, get over it. And it also, in some cases, can gloss over the fact that some of the things that are happening to them are illegal and can also have profoundly harmful consequences. So when I'm talking about this term tech-facilitated sexual violence, and in the presentation, you'll see the acronym TFSV, I'm talking about the way sexual violence is increasingly facilitated by digital technologies. So this means that tech is involved in some way. Now, whether it's an act of sexual violence that's been filmed and shared online, or the use of things like spy cams to record people in private spaces for sexual purposes, or the use of GPS or other kind of geolocation technology to stalk people. It can include things like non-consensually sharing nude images, or increasingly, as we've seen, the use of AI to generate nude images. So on the screen, you can see a list of these kinds of harms. There are other harms that aren't sexualized in nature, but are actually still really important to recognize. So things like homophobic, transphobic, misogynistic, or racist comments online, outing people online. We've really seen the rise of a lot of self-harm and gore videos and even animal cruelty. And there was a case again in London recently, animal cruelty video that was kind of going viral among young people, myths and disinformation. You may have heard, if those of you who kind of talk to young people, the creation of these fake accounts that are often used to bully other people, and other forms of financial scams. So my team is going around Canada. We're talking to teens, so 13 to 18-year-olds, about their experiences online. And I'm going to share with you some of the key findings that we've recently done. So we've conducted 26 focus groups with almost 150 young people all across Canada. And I'm going to share with you some of the findings, and then we're going to talk about some of the important things that you need to know as a parent. So we're in the midst of still analyzing this data, so I don't have final stats, but even without this, you know, our team has really become aware of several key findings. And one of the first things is that there is no one size fits all for the type of harm. Harms are very much linked to things like the child's gender or sexuality or race or age. We are starting to see some patterns emerge, but this really depends on who the child is. So girls' experiences are different from boys, which are different from trans and non-binary children. And I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind. And this is a real challenge for policymakers and educators when thinking about solutions. Again, it means that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. But what we're seeing are some common patterns. So we're seeing things such as the fact that many of these harms are normalized. So in fact, when we talk to young people, some of the things that they're telling us about, they don't even recognize as a form of harm. They're using language with us like, oh, there's something that happened that was really weird or strange. So girls, for example, will talk about getting bombarded with unwanted dick pics from older men or even their classmates. It happens so frequently that they don't even recognize it as a form of harm. And this is really interesting for us because we think that there's a pretty good understanding that, say you are walking down the street and someone flashes themselves at you, you would understand that that is a violation, that that's a form of sexual violence. But when it happens in these online spaces, it's not being regarded in the same way. They're just saying, oh, that's really strange or weird. They're not recognizing it as a form of sexual violence. We know that algorithms are fueling harms. Boys in particular, they're telling us about how they're being fed increasingly gory and misogynistic and right-wing content, from people getting shot, hurt, hit by cars, animal cruelty, and they're telling us about this content that's being fed to them without them asking for it. And we know for girls, they're being fed a lot of harmful images around like body issues, so kind of the like self-harm. Thinspiration is how it's often been referred to. It's kind of like promoting disordered eating, anorexia, all of those sorts of things. And they're becoming desensitized to this content. And this is something that really needs to be done then from the social media companies' end around content moderation policies. We also know that there are really important gaps in young people's understanding of relevant laws. So we talk to young people and we ask them about the laws that they know. And they regularly tell us about laws that they know about. And these are laws that don't exist or they don't apply in Canada. And this is actually really important, not because we're pushing for these criminalized responses, but because we think it's so important for young people or for everybody to know their rights. And we think that some of this misinformation about laws is actively hurting young people and it's preventing them from getting help. I'm going to explain a little bit more in a minute, but young people, for example, think that they're going to be charged with creating child pornography if they take an intimate image of themselves, and that is not true. And so that means then that if you have an intimate image that you've taken of yourself, you've consensually shared, and then it gets spread without your consent, young people won't go for help because they think that they will be criminalized for taking the image in the first place. And that is incredibly worrying. We also know, talking to young people, that they either don't know where to go for further support, or sometimes they don't even know what supports are available. And young people consistently tell us about how they're disillusioned by the help that they've had. So, I went and talked to a parent, I went and talked to a teacher, I went and spoke to the police, or I went and reported something to the social media company, and it either didn't help or it actively made things worse. And that's incredibly worrying. Because, as I'm going to show later in the presentation, there are so many places that young people can go and get help for the issues that they're experiencing. So I want to start by talking about laws and just giving a brief overview of some relevant laws in Canada and how they can help. And one thing's really clear. So when it comes to the law and these issues, young people don't know their rights. Most adults don't know the rights. They're unfamiliar with Canadian laws, or they've picked up this legal knowledge that applies in other contexts, most often the States or sometimes the UK. And they consume this through watching a lot of, say, American television. And, it's not a surprise that most people don't understand the law and legal system, and that's because they can be really complex and hard to understand. But our team thinks it's incredibly important for young people to know their rights and to know what the relevant laws are. But that being said, we also know that most young people will never use the law as a tool to solve their problems. It's often too expensive, it takes too long for what they need. But nevertheless, it can be really important to know what the relevant laws are. And in fact, we think that knowledge of these relevant laws can sometimes be more helpful for adults who, for example, may have a duty to report, or who young people may turn to help support them through some of these things. So for those who don't know, in Canada, we have both criminal and civil laws that could be relevant to some of these harms that I've talked about already. So for example, some of you may have heard of Bill C-63, the online harms bill. That's being kind of tabled right now as we speak. And among other things, this promises to regulate social media companies. And I think that's really important to have an ombudsman to whom people can complain to and hold social media companies accountable if they're not, for example, taking content down fast enough or kind of following their own terms of service. We do see young people using moderation on social media a lot more than the law, but I'm going to start a little bit with the law, and I'm going to start with criminal law. So there are some pros of using criminal law, and one of them is that the investigation can be done by the state. So that means, for example, that police, they have a lot of power to investigate these crimes, and they can, for example, force social media companies to hand over data or other information that can be essential for prosecution. One of the cons is that we know that there's institutional sexism and racism in criminal law, and not everybody is served by these systems. And often, especially when we think of young people with this peer-to-peer abuse, we often think of some of these harms as happening by adults to children, and that is absolutely happening. But a lot of these harms are happening among young people themselves, as we saw over the past few weeks with the deepfake nudes that were generated at St. Thomas Aquinas here in London. So these are peers who are generating these images of other peers. And in these cases, when the victim and the perpetrator know each other, they often don't want to criminalize them. They maybe want, they want other solutions, but they're not wanting a criminal record. They don't want them to go to jail. So there are often calls for new laws in Canada to deal with tech harms, but the truth is that we have existing laws that, if used properly, can deal with some of the harms that are caused. So in Canada, we already have laws on harassment and extortion and laws around sexual contact with children, and these apply in both on and offline cases. So for example, during COVID, one of the trends that we saw was how many young people were engaging in sexual relationships online. And in some cases, especially with young boys, people were pretending to be potential sexual partners and asking for intimate images. So we can call this catfishing. And once they had those images, they were then using them to extort money. So we can think of this as sextortion. This harm is very, very distressing. But these kinds of practices fit within existing extortion laws. So we don't need new laws for the online space. When we look at criminal law, there are also some tech-specific laws. So we have laws around child pornography. Now, one of the things that I really spend a lot of time, and my team spends a lot of time educating people about, is that children or young people are taught a real fear-based focus on the law. And a lot of young people are misinformed about these laws, especially around child pornography. And young people are told, for example, that no matter what they do, if you take a nude image of yourself, this is illegal, and they're creating child pornography. But in fact, we had a Supreme Court case, R.V. Sharp, where the Supreme Court of Canada said that if a young person takes a photo of themselves, an intimate photo of themselves, that's not harming or exploiting themselves, and that's really what child pornography is, exploitation. Okay, so it's about exploitation of children, and that's what these child pornography laws are meant to protect. Then the Supreme Court of Canada says there's something called a private exemption. So in fact, taking a picture of oneself is not a crime. And this is also true of people who are engaged in legal sexual activity. So say, for example, we have two 16-year-olds who may have taken intimate photos of each other or of themselves and shared it with each other, but not with other people without consent. So I'm 16, I take an image of myself, I share it with another 16 or 17-year-old. This also fits within the private exemption rule. So they will not be charged with creating or disseminating child pornography, as long as there is consent, as long as it constitutes legal sexual activity. And this is really, really important. So it's also important, we think, for young people to know that having a sexuality is a normal part of growing up. And I think we all need to face the fact that digital technologies are increasingly going to play a role in how they explore and express this sexuality. So our team's message is that it can be normal and healthy, to have digital technologies play a role in your sexuality and the expression. But if this behavior becomes exploitative, if it's adults who are asking or pressuring or sending images, or if people are sharing these images without consent or threatening young people to share their images without consent, then it's at these points that law around content changes. So it's no longer consensual, it's no longer legal. And we think we need to better inform young people about these laws and really avoid this fear-mongering messages that young people are often told. So some of you may know that there are also criminal laws that apply all across Canada around non-consensual distribution of intimate images. So it is illegal to share someone else's nude image without that person's consent. And we think that's also really important for young people to understand. We've heard a lot about deepfakes recently. There are no explicit laws in Canada around deepfakes or altered images, but this could change with Bill C-63. So this is the new online harms bill that's being debated. If this law passes, it will include these altered, or sometimes they're called synthetic images, but this law isn't on the table yet. It hasn't been passed. It's also possible that deepfakes could be prosecuted under Canada's criminal code, which prohibits these non-consensual distribution of intimate images, but so far this hasn't been tested. And to date in Canada, there's only been one reported criminal case where a person was successfully prosecuted under child pornography provision for making non-consensual sexual deepfakes. But again, we don't know how this applies when it's children doing it of other children. So that was a case when it was an adult making these images of children. So my team has actually created an infographic around nude images and the law, and this is available on our website, diydigitalsafety.ca, where we, if you don't remember everything I've said today, we've created this infographic, and we've created one for young people, and that's what you see on the screen. And we've also created one for people who work with young people, so for teachers or parents as well. So you can find this out on our website. So when it comes to civil laws, what we've seen in recent years is most provinces now have laws around non-consensual distribution of intimate images, so NCDII. Ontario is actually one of the exceptions. So there isn't an explicit law, but there is precedent. There are legal precedents that have been used that basically say that if someone non-consensually shares your intimate image, you can go after them for damages. And there are ways of getting these images taken down quite quickly. There's a lot of information here. Again, not all of it is relevant in Ontario, but what's important for people to know is that there are other civil laws that can be used to remedy some harm. So laws around privacy and copyright. Surprisingly, copyright seems to be one of the most effective laws that's often used to have intimate images removed off, say, porn websites. Because if you took the image, shared it with someone else, you say, I own the copyright to that image. For example, porn sites are very quick. They want to take these images down quite quickly. So that one's always a big surprise that that's been very successful. That's a little bit about the laws. I'm not going to go into too much more detail, but of course, please, you can ask questions in the Q&A. I want to talk now about some tech options and resources, because again, in truth, these are the options that I think most people are going to use and need. And there's some great tech options out there. So for example, there's lots of options for reporting content, blocking harassers, flagging content for social media companies to remove the content. And I'm going to introduce you to a few. Some of them are from Canada and some are not, but the content is useful just the same. So the first organization is called Right to Be. This is actually an American company. And one of the things, an American organization, a charity. One of the things I really like about this resource is that it gives you information about how to, for example, change privacy settings and report offensive content. They have a really great website where you can get safety guides for different social media platforms. So it's updated regularly. It gives you lots of information about how to get content taken down and how to change your privacy settings. And changing privacy settings can be really important to blocking some forms of, say, unwanted nude images from strangers. And there's lots of useful resources. So, if you're experiencing online harassment, things about how you can take care of yourself, how you can be an upstander, intervene. And then the legal rights are less applicable because that's for an American context. In Canada, one of the top resources you should know is called Need Help Now. This is a really amazing site. It's run by CyberTip, which is run out of Manitoba. And that's also a place where your kids or you can report on behalf of a child instances of abuse and exploitation. So this is a website that's really, or a resource that's for young people under the age of 18. And it offers advice on how to have offending accounts suspended or removed, how to take images down, and also really importantly, how to connect young people to additional supports like counseling or therapy or victim services in your local area. If you don't know, Kids Help Phone Line, this is also like a really wonderful resource. And it's not just a phone line, it's also a website. So this is a screenshot that I took from it today. And I recommend having this phone number, the Kids Help phone number, tacked up somewhere public in your house, like put it on the fridge, put it on a whiteboard. Kids can text with a crisis responder or call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's confidential and can also be anonymous. And this is something that young people tell us is really important. Parents don't like hearing this, but parents are often young people are terrified of their parents finding out what's happening to them. And so that's often stopping them from going from support. So knowing that there are anonymous and confidential resources can be really important. So many of you probably will have heard that sextortion is on the rise, and there's sites like Stop NCII, so non-consensual sharing of intimate images. And this is another website that has really great resources. I will point out, this is for those who are over 18, and you can register an intimate image. It's something called a hash, and this means that the image cannot be posted or reposted on major platforms like Facebook or Instagram or any porn site. So this one is not a Canadian site, but one that does the same thing is called Project Arachnid. So this is for Canadians under the age of 18. If you've had an intimate image that has been uploaded, say, to any kind of social media site or website, again, you register the image as a hash and it's automatically removed online from any websites or platforms. And again, this is run through CyberTip out in Manitoba. I do want to flag that in some cases, this option may result in police involvement in some of the cases, which again is not something all young people want. And so it's important to kind of flag that. For adults and carers and service providers, if you don't know, techsafety.ca should be on your radar. This is a really fabulous website. It's been launched just for over a year now, and I really highly recommend it. It has some fabulous resources for those adults who support and work with young people. So for example, here's a screenshot of advice on how you support a teen who's experiencing digital dating violence. And they give examples how you can talk to kids who are experiencing this dating violence. And just the final resource I'm going to share is from my own project website, DIYdigitalsafety.ca. You can't quite see it probably that well, but across the tab, we have different resources and also public engagement. This is our website where we host infographics that we create on things like nudes and the law, know your rights. We've written public reports. We've reviewed all of the educational curriculum and education acts in all provinces and territories in Canada. So we've written a report about that, and we also have some recommendations as well. And we also have some specific guidance for different support services. So the ones that I've just mentioned today, we have links to them on our site as well. Okay, I want to finish off by just talking about how can we talk to teens about online harms or tech-facilitated violence. The truth is, we can't guarantee that bad things aren't going to happen to our kids in this world, whether it's online or offline. But what I think we can try to do is minimize the harm, show young people where to go for help, and also help them develop resiliency and different skills so that they don't make the same mistakes twice, or at least if they continue to make the same mistakes, they know where to go for help if they do. So I want to start with some things that I think you should all avoid when talking to your children or other children, or for any of you are teachers, things that I think you should avoid saying to kids. The first thing I think you should do is, don't dismiss what they say because it's only online. It's not. The line between the two worlds is increasingly blurring. And again, something that happens to you in an online space can carry with you into offline spaces. And we know through many examples of tech-facilitated sexual violence, things that are happening in real life can be filmed and recorded and shared online and have hurtful consequences. So really try to avoid just saying, don't taking it seriously because it's online. The second one may be controversial for some of you, but I really recommend simply not taking their device away. And the reason I say don't just take their device away is if that's going to solve the problem, because it's not a long-term solution. What happens when they get their device back, or what happens when they go behind your back and buy a new one? And many of the young people we speak to have multiple devices. It's also probably going to stop them from coming to you in the future when things go wrong, if they think the only thing you're going to do is take their device away. Now, I sit here and say, don't just take the device away. What I'm not saying is that you can't have boundaries or limits around the devices. I think having these boundaries is incredibly important and essential. You should have rules around phone use, device use. That is perfectly fine. And I think that's incredibly important. And I could talk more in the Q&A ideas about how you can create those boundaries together. You know, you start off when your child or a young person starts using digital devices and technologies, it's important to have strict boundaries. And over time, you can kind of start to back off or loosen those boundaries and those rules. But yes, you should have rules and limits with your device. I think that's incredibly important. Avoid immediately blaming them, even if they are partly or you feel wholly responsible for the harm that they've experienced. And just remember that poor decisions can be a good learning opportunity. And it's important for them to know that you're on their side. So I would say just focus on the teachable moments here. Where did they go wrong? What could they do differently going forward? What sorts of things do they need to do to kind of make the situation right? Another thing I will say, I really recommend not simply spying on your kids. I do a lot of these parent engagement sessions, and one of the questions I'm most often asked is, what's the best app or device I can use to kind of, keep an eye on my kids, to monitor them all the time? And I would say kids are incredibly talented at avoiding surveillance. And I think it's really important for you to have trust in your relationship with each other. And if all you're doing is just spying, monitoring them, what you're teaching them is that it's okay to spy and invade the privacy of people that they're in relationships with. And I would argue that this is actually fundamentally a sign of an unhealthy relationship at any level. And if any of you go, talk to frontline service workers in women's shelters or in the gender-based violence space, this cyber stalking and surveillance is huge, and it's incredibly damaging. And really what I would hope parents avoid doing is teaching their kids that it's okay to have people spy on you, to know where you are all the time, to check your devices. We can talk more about this in the Q&A. Really avoid trying to scare young people out of certain acts. So this kind of messaging of like, it's illegal, you're going to go to jail if you send that image. These approaches don't work. And what we found talking to young people is it stops them going to adults for help because they worry that they're going to be criminalized or penalized. Even though you might be thinking it in your head, avoid these messages of only an idiot would send a naked picture of themselves. Only an idiot would have fallen for that scam. Only an idiot would have added that person as a friend on their devices. Again, this messaging stops young people from going for help because they're embarrassed. Okay. Don't tell children that once an image is out there, it's out there forever. Your life is over. You're never going to get a job. You're never going to get into that university. One of the most heartbreaking things about the work that I do is a lot of the children recently who have died by suicide. These are the messages that they've internalized. They think, oh my God, I made a mistake. My life is over. And these are the messages that are being taught by teachers. Police are regularly going into schools, giving assemblies. Parents are giving this message to young people, and it is incredibly damaging. This is not true. Images can be removed, and telling young people that their lives are over is very damaging to their well-being. And instead, we need to focus on, bad things may have happened, and this might be a really tough time for you, but there's always a way forward. It might be tough, but you can get through it. We think that's the message young people need to hear. So kind of linked to the point of like, don't just spy on your kids. Don't just rely on tech to solve your problem. Yes, tech can be a tool that parents can use to help set boundaries. So a timer, once you've been on an app for a certain amount of time, absolutely. But just relying on these apps that monitor and spy on your kids, or if you think an app that like turns the internet off at 10 o'clock is the ticket and the solution to keeping your kids safe, you're wrong. It's a poor substitute for conversation and giving your kids the lifelong skills that they need to use the tech. In recent research I did in the UK with around 600 young people, we found that nearly half of them knew how to bypass the parental filters and controls anyways. And I could tell you a lot about the creative solutions. Again, in these focus groups we've been doing around Canada, young people have very creative and clever ways of getting around these filters and the tech that their parents have put in place. So it's not that it can't play a role, but it should not be your only solution. Instead, things that you should do. You should teach your children about their rights. They have a right to privacy. They have a right to bodily autonomy and sexual integrity. We need to teach young people that they should have control over their sexual boundaries and their sexual experiences, whether this is online or in person. This includes things like they should have a right to decide who gets to touch them or who gets to view their intimate images. So it means that when I speak to young people about sharing other people's images without consent, I'm not just emphasizing the laws, I'm teaching them that it's wrong to share someone's nudes, not just because you could go to jail or pay a fine. It's wrong because it invades someone's privacy. It threatens their bodily autonomy and their sexual integrity. So we think it's really important to focus on how we can behave ethically and not just avoid this punishment. When you talk to your kids, encourage skepticism about what they see, hear, and are asked to do online. I have 3 children. I have 3 boys. I'm constantly asking my kids about what they're seeing online. Is it real? How do you know? Why? Why might someone do that? Why might someone create content that's, set up or fake? How could someone use this against me? So teach them to be skeptical as hell, I think is the best advice. And kind of, go into these situations with that critical awareness. Think before they act or post. This is a really difficult one. We know that young people's brains are still developing and impulse control is not fully developed, but where possible, before you post something, take a minute, walk around the room, think about, is that something that you really want to share or post? Again, I recognize that's easier said than done because their beautiful little brains are still developing, but try to instill that. And really get them to consider what is okay or not okay to share about other people online. Like, when might it be okay to share someone's photo or a private conversation that you've had? Are there circumstances when it's okay? Get them thinking through these scenarios so that they know how to act ethically online. And if they run into these scenarios, they know what to do. You should get young people to reflect on the information that they share about themselves online and how might people misuse this information. You need to get them to reflect on what rights do they have to safety in these online spaces. Are they aware of these rights? What are the rights? You should help them identify abusive behaviors and ask their input on how to address these. So if something bad has happened to them, don't just try to solve the problem for them. It's really important to ask young people for their input. Start getting them to, giving them agency, getting them to learn how to advocate for themselves and also solve these problems in the future. You're their parents. Hopefully you're there for them for their whole life, but you don't want to be solving your 30-year-old child's problems for them. Ideally, you want your children to know how to solve problems on their own. So one of the things I recommend doing is role playing through different scenarios. Like, what would you do if? Or how could you do better going forward? Maybe you made a mistake, and it's really difficult as parents to accept our children can be the ones who are perpetrating these harms, not just victims. So if you think your child has forwarded on a nude image that they've seen come through in a chat, well, let's talk to them about why it's harmful, how it violates the person's rights, and if this happened again, what are some things that you could do? So role play through those different scenarios. And encourage them to think about how they can be an upstander and change the culture. So again, if they recognize that some of these practices are harmful, what are the things that they can do to stop? Maybe they're not confident kind of calling out the perpetrator, but maybe they can go and check in on the victim and see if they're okay. Maybe there is a trusted adult that they can talk to where they can kind of refer the other young people. So get them to think about how they can be the ones who are making digital spaces a healthier and happier and more joyful place rather than kind of causing harm. And I'll just finish off by saying, remember, tech use, I think, should be incremental and it should be appropriate for their evolving development and capacity. So a 10-year-old's development and capacity is different from a 16 and 17-year-old's development and capacity. I don't have the magic answer for saying, oh, when your child turns this age, they should automatically, be okay to use certain devices. It doesn't quite work like that. But I would say, as a general rule, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A, don't just hand over your tablet and phone and set them off and say good luck. We should be slowly introducing tech and build these skills up as they go. And as they get older and more confident, we should kind of start to back up a little. I would say focus on tech skills, ethical decision making, and critical thinking. And these are really the foundations to digital literacy and digital citizenship. Yeah, it involves technical skills like understanding how to adjust your privacy settings, how to block and report, but it also involves acting ethically and respecting personal boundaries. So get them to really question the kind of information they're seeing and how trustworthy it is. And these are all really important life skills. And just remember, as parents, don't be too hard on yourself. It takes time and effort. It's not developed overnight. And we're probably still going to make mistakes as well, because this is totally new territory for young people as well as us. So I'm going to finish there and stop sharing my screen. And I know I've left us plenty of time for questions or thoughts or comments.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And so what I'm going to do, because I know sometimes, again, tech doesn't always cooperate with us. What I do, just in case you're unable to access the Q&A, is I'm just in the process of allowing attendee microphones. So if you're more comfortable asking your question through your microphone, you should be able to use them now. If you're able to use the put up your hand feature, we welcome it and invite it. But we also recognize that you might just be able to unmute. At this point in time, Caitlin, there are no questions through in the Q&A. So we'll give people a few moments. I know there's lots to reflect on there. And we'll go from there. Okay, so we have a question come in, and I'm also just going to publish that website for everybody there as well. But one of the questions that came in is, what are your thoughts on a tech contract?
I love it. Because again, I think that this is so important to have these kinds of agreements that are co-created. I think that parents who involve children in decisions about the technology are going to be far more successful than parents who are simply imposing their rules on the children. And these tech contracts, I mean, I don't know what this attendee has in mind, but it can be things like, at what age maybe can you start using certain platforms or certain devices? How long are you allowed to spend online per day? It may be what sorts of behaviors are acceptable or not acceptable, and also thinking through the consequences. Like, okay, if I find out that you've broken these, what are acceptable consequences? And again, getting young people to play a role in determining the boundaries, I think, is again so much more empowering for young people than a parent just saying, okay, tech is off at 10, or it can even be things like, where in the house are you allowed to use the tech? I know lots of friends who say, no tech in the bedrooms, or no tech in the bedrooms after a certain time. So again, engaging young people in those conversations, I think, is a really, really great way to go forward.
I love that, especially highlighting that idea of co-creation, right? And that involvement, so that it's them also participating and building the skills and feeling empowered is a big piece of it.
Yeah.
And Caitlin, just while we wait to see any other questions come through, and if anybody wants to turn on their mic at any point, please feel free. But I'm curious, kind of on that note, you had mentioned potentially addressing more about this idea of like, what can some of those boundaries look like, or how can you help set some of those boundaries? So whether it's through the form of a tech contract, or are there other suggestions that you might have?
Yeah. Again, I think it's things about like which apps are people using. It can be even things about the privacy settings. So on which apps are you allowed to engage with strangers? On which apps are you allowed to engage with friends? Those can be things that, again, you can kind of set boundaries around. Again, the time limit, I think, can be an important one. Or it could even be things like you can go on social media, but not until you've done your homework, or, making sure that young people are still kind of engaged in other kind of like daily responsibilities and chores that I think are required of them. So I think the really great thing about this idea of this like tech contract is that it can be super flexible, and it can just involve so many different elements. Again, which social media platforms you can use, length of time, age in which you start using them, it can be, yeah, it can be really flexible. And I would imagine that there'd be some great examples that you could find online. I'm sure that other people have thought of this, and I'm sure that there's some books as well that would probably have some templates that parents could follow.
I like that idea of a template.
Yeah.
Another question has come in, and it says, I wonder if your team might offer a session or tech safety camp or kind of a workshop for kids or kids and their parents together.
Mhm.
So maybe expanding on what some of the other opportunities are that families can engage with your organization and team.
100%. So on our website, there's our email address. And if you're interested in bringing us in for a session, we can absolutely do that. We have done ones with parents and teens. We also do ones just for teens. So ones with teens are things like, I think it's called like Know Your Rights. And it really focuses on letting young people know what their rights and their responsibilities are. And we take them through some of the scenarios that I was mentioning. So we talk about the Taylor Swift deepfake is one popular example. And we get young people to think about, what are the rights being violated? If you saw something like this happening, what could you do to be an upstander or a bystander? How could you intervene? And we use a lot of real life examples, and there have been a few, like, unfortunately, really tragic cases in Canada. Some of you may remember the Rehtaeh Parsons case in Nova Scotia. A young woman and was sexually assaulted, and this was filmed and recorded and shared online. And there were multiple failings, from the people who were taking the images, the people who were sharing the images, the schools that did nothing about it, the police that didn't take it seriously. And again, getting people to think through what are the points where things went wrong and what could people do differently. So we really think that having kind of teachable moments and real life examples can be really powerful. And getting young people to, again, just think through, what would you do? And again, understanding the points of, like, what are the rights that are being violated? We're really trying to emphasize these rights aspect.
Thank you. Another question just came in, wondering about any suggestions for guarding against the addictive nature of apps.
Yes. It's so tough. Any of you, for example, TikTok, I have never found an app that is more addictive than TikTok. That's one of those platforms that I go on. I think I'll only be on it for 5 minutes, and an hour later, and I am just like floored by how fast time goes. So there's a few things that you can do. You can have timers set, and in fact, a lot of these apps actually have built-in timers, and so there's instruction guides. Like YouTube has lots of videos. So for example, on Instagram or TikTok, you can say, alert me when 20 minutes has passed. So built into some of these apps themselves are these timers. There are also other apps that you can download. So there's one, and I can't remember what it's called, but basically anytime you try to open up a social media app, it asks you, do you really want to go to this app, or are you just bored? Like, is there something else that you can be doing? That's not going to stop necessarily. But another thing you can do is on your phone, you can change the color scale. So right now, part of the reason why these apps are so addictive is because they work with psychologists who understand how our brains work, and they understand the importance of color and having, like, notifications coming in. And these are things that help make these addictions more powerful. So if you change the color scale of your phone to a gray, the apps just aren't as enticing. The platforms just aren't as enticing. So that's kind of like and I know a lot of adults will do this, because again, it's not just kids who are addicted to their phones, it's many adults who are addicted to our phones as well. So changing the grayscale can really make a difference. Turning off the notifications so that you're not tempted to go back to the platform every time you get a ding, a ding, a ding. So those are just a few things. I would say, though, for any parent who, because I think there's also a difference between, my child is, we sometimes say, oh, my child is addicted. Or are they actually addicted? And when I'm talking about addicted, I mean things like, do they feel severe discomfort and anxiety when they can't get back on the platform? Is their use of the platform or the app disrupting other elements of their life, like their sleep? They're not wanting to sleep because they're wanting to stay on the platform too long. If you actually feel that your child has developed like a true addiction, then I think it's also important to go and seek professional help. And there are lots of psychologists out there who I think can help guide and counsel children through these addictions. So there's certain things around like self-regulation, time management, making the phones and devices less appealing, to actually at some point you may need to go and seek professional help.
Thank you for that. Nothing else in this moment. We'll give a few more minutes there. And I'm also curious, I know you had given that fantastic, what was the first website that you suggested about where they had the recommendations about how to go in and have all those different settings?
I think that one was Need Help. Oh, so Need Help Now or Right to Be.
Right
So
to
Need
Be,
Help.
that was the
Yeah,
one.
Right to Be. Yeah, Right to Be is a really great website and a really great resource. So again, also we sometimes assume that kids are really tech savvy, and sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. And I'm really amazed at talking to lots of teenagers over the past few months. Some of them know how to change their privacy settings and they know how to do all the tech stuff, and some totally don't. But I also want to remind people on this call that just having the digital literacy skills isn't necessarily going to stop you from experiencing harm. So just because you know how to change your privacy settings doesn't mean that nothing bad will ever happen to you. So again, for parents, don't just think, oh, my kid is so tech savvy, nothing bad is going to happen. That's not necessarily a protection. And in fact, sometimes having more tech skills means that they're more confident and perhaps they're exploring, different websites, or they're on tech more often. So in some cases, it can actually open them up to more forms of harm.
I will add one more question and then we'll see, we might wrap up after that there, Cindy, if no one else has any other questions. But I'm just curious, especially given this platform between school boards and this partnership, which is fantastic. And then again, this kind of caregiver lens, you had mentioned that instance out on the East Coast, and just the number of ways where there was maybe some teachable moments, let's call them. And I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions for caregivers, as many are on the call, in terms of how they can help support their child in that relationship with schools, or what to expect if they do need to kind of advocate or reach out.
Such a great question. It kind of breaks my heart a bit to say that schools are sometimes not safe places. Schools, young people tell us about how reporting to schools made things worse. And it can be because, young people will say that either they didn't take the case serious enough or they blew it way out of proportion. So they called the parents in. They didn't want their parents involved. They just wanted this sorted out, between them and the peer. And the parents were called in, or the police were called in, and now everybody knows about it and they feel incredibly embarrassed. We have spoken to some young people, including those here in London, though, who have had like really great teachers. So it kind of sometimes depends on the individual, or maybe the school has like a really great administration and they kind of understand trauma-informed responses to sexual violence, or maybe they have more training in terms of like other forms of resolutions that aren't just going through the judicial system. But I hate to say that it is not an even playing field out there, and some schools are just inherently not safe. So parents can try to bring it up to the schools, and they may do something about it, they may not do something about it, or they may act in a way that is actually more harmful for the child. So what I would say is talk to the child and ask them, involve them in the decision-making process. I think that's the most important thing. What is it that they want? What does a positive or like a good solution or outcome look like to them? Is it that they just want the harm acknowledged and maybe the perpetrator to say sorry? Is it that they maybe don't want to have to sit in class with that person anymore? But I would really try to advocate, get your child to kind of be involved in the process, because young people constantly tell us there is nothing more disempowering than, disclosing that something has happened and then being totally left out of the loop. And in some cases, young people aren't even informed about what the outcome of investigations are. And that is incredibly, incredibly disempowering for young people.
Thank you for that. And I can certainly agree that's something we have a lot of conversations about within our team and within the board, just about how we involve the youth, right? Like how their voice matters. And again, that empowerment piece as well. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'm going to check our Q&A one more time, but otherwise I think we are good to close out. So I'll let Cindy pull up that last slide. No, thank you. This was incredible.
And if I can just say again, please check out our website if you think it would be useful to have a session. please just reach out to our team. And if we can do it, we will. And spread the news. If you feel as though you've learned anything today, pass the message on. We think it's really important that this information is shared as widely as possible.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Caitlin, for all this relevant information. I've learned so much, and thank you for your offer to continue this conversation. And I hope that this conversation we can continue to talk more in our schools as well. So as you'll notice on the screen, we do have, as I mentioned in our first slide, that we do have contact information for myself and Caitlin. If you did want to contact us directly, we would really appreciate if you would just take a few minutes, because we're always looking to gather feedback about this presentation. There's a QR there, or as well as a link. And as well, we put a link that will let you know about further upcoming workshops, and you can also sign up for our mailing list as well. So if you could just take a few minutes, we would appreciate that so much, as it'll continue to help us build our webinars and offer more information. And we wish everyone a fantastic evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.